Manning Broom.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kinchin. I believe we are now live streaming. Is that correct, Lindsay? Okay. Just want to make sure the public is able to view via the live stream on YouTube. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see everybody again, including our September 30th Equity Advisory meeting, which we'll get a report out on shortly. This is the fourth meeting of the Climate Initiative in the same amount of weeks. And so we appreciate all of your engagement. We appreciate the public tuning in and engaging as well. Today's meeting will really be diving into this consequence analysis and trying to understand the impacts of this draft portfolio, as well as better understand its impact on driving down greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other co-benefits as well. And we will also be hearing about the public input, the very robust public input and input from our advisory groups and committees on this draft portfolio, so that this task force is armed with as much information and perspectives as possible. So we have a lot to get into, but I do want to also recognize that later this week, Governor John Bell Edwards will be traveling to Scotland for the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, to make the case that while Louisiana is suffering severe consequences related to the world's changing climate, no state is better positioned to be a leader in the energy landscape. And Governor Edwards will be joined by cabinet secretaries and advisors, including members of this Climate Initiatives Task Force, to help shape the international discussion around climate change, cleaner energy, and creating sustainable communities in the face of a changing climate. Many others from Louisiana will be there as well, as including task force members Colette Pichon-Battle and Camille Manning Broom. So I know Louisiana will be well represented on this world stage. So looking forward to that, but I wanted to make sure everybody was aware. And so with that, we will move to approval of the minutes, which were circulated to task force. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
A motion by Mr. Daniels is second.
Second.
Second by Mr. Berg. Any discussion? Any public comment? All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. All right, minutes approved. We will next move on to a report on the September Special Equity Advisory Group meeting from the Advisory Group Chair, Colette Pichon-Battle. The floor is yours, Ms. Battle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bonjour, y'all. Colette Pichon-Battle here. Really great to see everyone calling in from Scotland. Looking forward to the governor and others joining here. There are already lots of people on the ground here waiting for this very important international moment. But I'm reporting just quickly to the task force to let y'all know that we did have a special equity advisory group. Y'all hear me talking all the time on this task force about my great concern for our approach to the climate crisis as one that focuses just on emissions. And while it is absolutely a major part of the solutions that we have to build, I've struggled with the task force's lack of attention to the human impacts of the climate crisis on the people of this planet and the communities of South Louisiana and Louisiana as a state. It's still my belief that to advance equity, the task force and the process will need to bring in the people and the voices of the many communities being impacted. And that is what we were able to do. Earlier this summer, myself as chair of the Equity Advisory Group, along with the governor's office, advanced a joint idea to have a special session of the Equity Advisory Group. This 2-hour special session was held on September 30th. We held it in the evening. As many of you have heard, communities want to know more, but they're not always able to participate in these sessions that happen during the day. So we held it in the evening, and we were going for greater participation, which I believe we had a great step toward. We had about 50 to 60 participants on the call. And we called this meeting to help really connect the dots between the current climate disasters that are disproportionately impacting Black and Indigenous and poor and rural communities, and the urgent need for climate solutions that prioritize equity. While we were joined by representatives from 3 tribal nations and multiple longstanding Black communities, many more people were unable to attend. And some of our speakers were unable to attend because we were still in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. And many of you know our communities were without power for a long time. So even in this attempt to get more voices in the climate impacts really showed themselves. But we were able to really uncover some values. The people gathered and we asked the attendees to participate. We incorporated public comment throughout this session. And we heard from Louisianians all over the state. And what they really value about Louisiana, as you might not have heard, and this task force mentioned enough, is it's not just the jobs, it's not just the industry. In fact, no one mentioned those things. You know, they mentioned the things that they love about this state. We heard about our culture, our people, our food, our music, the natural landscape of the state. This is what we really heard people lifting up. In short, we love the culture that makes the state special. And I think that's not really a surprise to anyone here. We heard from Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar. We also heard from Chief Troy Carey of the Appalachian Indians. We heard from leaders of St. James Parish. We heard from the United Homa Nation in South Louisiana. We were able to hear from many local leaders. And I just want to make a point here, especially because Chief Parfait Dardar isn't on the call today. You know, there's been a call, some attention being called to the fact that we don't have enough Indigenous voices in these conversations as part of this process. And so we wanted to make some space for that. We had an expert panel. We heard from housing advocate Anjanika Morris, from energy advocate Logan Burke, water advocate Jessica Dandridge. We heard from Dr. Kenny Cole at Ochsner. We heard from Marguerite Green of Sprout, because we really wanted to make sure that folks were connecting the dots, not just on emissions reductions, but on how housing relies on renewable energy for us to advance more equity, how our health connects to these climate impacts that we're often talking about. And so some major themes that were lifted up were housing inefficiencies, electrification, and the need for more renewable energy. How working with nature was something that people really wanted to advance more than the gray infrastructure, and really sort of thinking about the green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We prioritized health. We heard from the folks who are living near these industrial facilities about how they don't want the industrial facilities. And this really came to me, you know, listening to that decarbonization session that says this is where these things are going to be focused, right where they are. So we got to hear from the voices that are right next to the facilities. We heard about sustainable farming. We heard about safe and secure housing and healthcare. These are all things that really came up as themes. And it's things that we should be considering as we advance equity in this task force, not just the numbers around emission reductions, but how housing and education and health all fit into this. I'll just finish by saying we've got a recording. I believe it's available on the governor's YouTube channel. If you weren't able to participate, I certainly encourage you to just listen to some of the testimony that was given. And we really concluded that equitable climate solutions have to prioritize people. And it has to help people meet their basic needs. Equity is going to require us to address the root causes of climate change. This is addressing the fossil fuel industry and all of the industries that are harming a lot of our communities across our state. It means we're going to have to eliminate harmful pollutants. It means we're going to have to look for solutions that are co-solutions and building on advancing other pieces. And we're going to have to really deal with the petrochemical industry, not just how we capture what is produced, but how we reduce what is being produced, and we reduce how communities are being harmed. Again, there were no this was really a process to hear more voices, to make sure that we could hear from the community, to make sure the task force has some record of engaging the community a little bit more in those things that are, not just the technical pieces, how everybody is thinking about this in their everyday. So again, I want to invite the task force members to take a listen to the recording. And if there are any questions, we're happy to answer, and we'll work with the governor's office to make sure that if folks want us to bring other things to the equity advisory group, that we do. And just wanted to give that report out to everyone to let you know that it's an important part of this process, y'all, that we include our people. And I think we achieved that. Mr. Chairman, if there are no questions, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Keyshawn Battle, any questions from our task force members?
No question, Mr. Chairman. Oh, go on.
Mr. Daniels?
I was just going to say thanks to Colette for sharing that report. And I really encourage folks to go look at video. It's a reminder of the incredible spirit and talent that we have across the state, folks who are doing amazing things that even I was not aware of. And so it's really good use of your time. I encourage folks to go check it out.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Was there somebody else?
That was me, Harry. Bill Robertson.
Oh, Mr. Robertson, go ahead.
Colette, did y'all talk rooftop solar?
Yes, sir. I believe there was conversation on rooftop solar, not just on independent housing, but on public housing, and how we think about renewable energy as something that advances the quality of life, not just for those who can, afford the mortgage and the independent house, but how we also advance fair housing and advancing this. It's a lot of questions folks have about renewable energy, how these things play out, but it was a assumption that this is where things were going. Rooftop solar, energy efficiency across the board, a lot of support across the board. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Well, I will just say thank you to Ms. Keyshawn Battle for organizing that meeting and hosting and chairing. It was a powerful meeting, particularly in the wake of Hurricane Ida. And so it's powerful. And yes, it is on the governor's climate YouTube page. So please check it out if you were not able to attend. So moving on to agenda item number 6, overview of evaluation process and meeting objectives from our project manager, Lindsay Cooper.
Thank you, Harry. And just wanted to note, as I share my screen for Inger, that we did have Tim Hardy, Mark Moses, and Greg Bowser join us today. So almost all of our members are here. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. My computer's a little funky today. So I just wanted to start off this meeting. I know I sent you all a lot of information yesterday, and this will be a content-heavy meeting. So just wanted to start this meeting by reframing a few of the things that we hope to accomplish in these couple hours today. So first, we want to provide an overview to all of you of how we've been evaluating and looking critically at this draft portfolio of the strategies and actions that our team developed back in August and released for comment then. And then we want to provide you with the consequence analysis, the results of how we've been reviewing this portfolio. So the process and then the results of that, as well as sharing as Harry mentioned, the public feedback, the great amount of feedback and technical insights into some of the specific strategies and actions. And then what our process for reviewing the portfolio and revising it for November looks like. And then we'd like to end this meeting discussing some key areas that you all see as key areas of the draft portfolio. So since this is a meeting with a lot of information to report out, this will be mainly a time for our planning team to update you all on what we've been accomplishing since our last meeting in July. So I know this is a lot of information to digest, and there's no expectation that we have a full-fledged discussion on recommendations and revisions today, but wanted you all to be apprised of what we've been working on in the past couple months. Just wanted to review the documents that we shared back in August. We shared 2 documents in August, a revised draft of this partial final report, which is the context information on the plan that we intend to include in December when we release the draft plan, alongside this draft portfolio of climate actions and strategies. But we focused a lot of the feedback on this draft portfolio. We'll focus this meeting too on the draft portfolio because that's the crux of what climate action will look like from Louisiana and what it will really look like to abate emissions for Louisiana. And as I mentioned, and as we put in the first paragraph, the first page of this draft portfolio, this was our best first pass at putting together a comprehensive set of actions and strategies for Louisiana to reduce emissions. We intentionally left out some areas from this draft portfolio that weren't necessarily clear in reading the portfolio. So a few of those areas included an implementation timeline and just the time frame of when we would adopt and move forward certain actions. This was intentionally left out so that we could use this EPS tool and use all of you and all of our public feedback to guide us as we create that timeline for implementation. So that was intentionally not part of this discussion and not part of the portfolio. And also a component missing from it was a tie to work that is ongoing in the state of Louisiana. So through our agencies, through our partners, through industries and communities, because we wanted to first define what are the next steps we need to take before tying it to all the work that has been done. Because there's a lot of work that this builds on in Louisiana. So the draft portfolio, 9 sections, 29 strategies, and 97 actions. And just a reminder that the strategies are high-level vision statements. They're meant to be very ambitious and far-reaching. And the actions are more policy-specific focus, readily implementable type of actions. So this evaluation process wanted to look at the portfolio through a few different lenses. So we have this consequence analysis that's looking at the portfolio comprehensively as one unit, as its ability to reduce our emissions through the energy policy simulator tool, and also through structured surveys by the advisory group members. So we're looking at the portfolio as a whole as it impacts our objectives quantitatively, but also qualitatively through the advisory group surveys. But knowing that this merits and requires even more eyes to look at it and more perspectives, we did take and really push our task force committees and the public, our state agencies and other implementation partners to give us a good critique and review of the strategies and actions specifically so that we can make them more feasible, more implementable, and bring them down to Louisiana's level a little bit. So we've been looking at this through many different lenses, and that's the range of feedback that we want to report out to all of you today. Just a reminder of why we're even looking at the portfolio critically. We're in step 4 of our decision-making process. So we want to be able to forecast potential consequences of this portfolio before we move into action. We want to understand what are the good things and the bad things that might come of the portfolio so that we can ensure that we're addressing that on the front end and not leaving that until after a decision is made. So this step is to help us evaluate the trade-offs well and to make a decision as best we can. And as a reminder of how we frame the consequence analysis, we're using quantitative and qualitative data, but all framed in the context of our fundamental objectives, what you all established earlier this year as our objectives in looking towards emission reduction across Louisiana. So we've done 2 rounds of this analysis. This meeting will look pretty similar to the meeting in June, if you all remember that one, where we have the graphics of the EPS tool showing emission reduction potential, but also graphics showing feedback from our advisory groups on the other objectives. But this time, instead of looking at those high-level hypothetical portfolios, we're taking it down to action in Louisiana through this action portfolio released in August. And our goals of this analysis were first to help you all as the task force understand the portfolio as a whole and how it might have potential positive and negative impacts, but also to help our team in the governor's office and to help the task force in refining and improving the overall portfolio to ensure that this is a comprehensive approach, but also that we have the right details and implementation steps for specific actions so that we are maximizing our co-benefits, which was a big point that we talked about in our summer month meetings. We also did ask in our survey to identify areas where we need additional focus in the coming years. What research is out there? Where can we continue to grow this knowledge? The more we know, the more we see we don't know. So this is important that we identify where more research is needed. So with that, I will hand it over to Supi Daliander to first walk through the qualitative feedback, and then Allison DeYoung will walk through the quantitative feedback.
Thank you, Lindsay. And for those keeping score, we're moving on to agenda item number 7.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen there. So as Lindsay mentioned, I'm going to go through some of the feedback that we got from the advisory groups from the structured surveys we sent out, where the primary focus was on the fundamental objectives related to the people, economy, and environment of Louisiana. So as just kind of review what they were asked to do. One thing was to provide a review to assess the portfolio on a scale of very negative to very positive. So if you remember, back when we had multiple portfolios and we were looking at business as usual, we did something similar. So now we can benchmark this draft portfolio of a complete set of strategies and actions against that. We opened it up where all of the advisory group members could provide feedback on any objective where they felt qualified based on their expertise. And part of that was based on the first round of consequence analysis when there was discussion of cascading effects. And so someone might be able to give feedback in an area because of a secondary impact related to something that they had good knowledge and understanding of. We asked them to provide feedback and comments to help give context for their ranking and to provide additional detail. And then we have 2 optional categories where people were allowed to select individual strategies and actions from a drop-down menu to give specific comments on those. We didn't want to sort of require that everyone give feedback on the 97 actions. That would obviously be a lot, and many things may be outside of people's area of expertise. But this way, everyone was able to give comments on any action or strategy that they felt that they had input on. In addition, another thing that came out of the first round of consequence analysis was we gave an option in the spreadsheet that people could identify additional resources or references that could be used. So we're collating that information and going through it. You can see in the graph, we had the number of individuals that responded within each of the advisory groups. So we had sort of varying representation across the groups. However, like I said, because of that cascading impacts, we actually had a good number of responses for all of the fundamental objectives. So to kind of step back and remind folks where we were when we did the first round of consequence analysis, where one of the portfolios that we looked at was business as usual. So what are the consequences of inaction if we don't take any action at all? And what you can see is that we had got generally negative feedback in this case. The overarching sense was that status quo means falling behind for a variety of reasons, including economic impacts, market pressure toward carbon neutral, infrastructure that without action would fall into repair, that there are continued need for upgrades, that there are disparate outcomes for marginalized people that would worsen, and concerns about cultural heritage loss. So in contrast, the feedback that we got on the draft strategy and action portfolio improved the outlook across a number of the fundamental objectives. And what I'm going to do next in the next few slides is go through these in a little bit more detail. So the charts that you're seeing there are the categories of fundamental objectives. So, for example, in quality of life, there's some things under the hood there as far as access to goods and services, cultural heritage, et cetera. So what I'm going to do now is go through each of those to give you a feel for what the comments were that were associated with these, as well as what a synthesis of what those rankings and predicted outcomes were. So in our quality of life objectives, there are 3 associated with these. They're listed on the slide, so I won't read them, but they're associated with access to goods and services, positive health outcomes, and preservation of cultural heritage. And those pie charts show the distribution of responses. And so what you can see is that we generally got, the most common response was positive for access to essential goods and for public health. And then we get a little bit more of a mixed responses for cultural heritage. For time's sake, I'm not going to go through every comment that we received, although you'll have access to those, raw and unfiltered, that you can go back and reference all of the Climate Task Force can go back and reference all of the input that we received. But some highlights of things that were noted, there were positive co-benefits of energy transition, the cleaner energy, and improved access would be something that would improve both that access as well as public health. And then the negative comments are associated with cultural heritage, kind of providing the nuance of what that mixed feedback was based on, were concerns that there was a lack of specificity on limiting the impact, particularly of CCUS pipelines, on marginalized and indigenous communities and or cultural heritage sites. In terms of our equity objectives, there were 3 objectives associated with this category. Again, I won't read them for time's sake. But we got generally positive or neutral outcomes predicted for reducing institutionalized harm and maximizing community engagement. Some of the comments we received are that, again, that there's potential co-benefits to this transformation that could be realized with depending on implementation. But there were concerns that there was some lack of specificity that might limit those positive outcomes. Specifically, one thing that was noted was a lack of specificity in engaging communities, or how they would be given ownership or leadership opportunities. We had relatively mixed feedback on the fundamental objective of disparity of future opportunities. Again, one of the things that was noted was sort of an insufficient specific focus on that throughout the plan, and that there was an absence of goals or metrics, that these outcomes would be more likely, the prediction would be more likely to be better if there were these specific metrics that then progress could be tracked against and adjusted as actions adjusted as needed. The next category of fundamental objectives essentially relates to short and long-term success. So these are essentially how likely do you believe that these actions will in practice achieve their goals, how effective they are, how timely it would be, how durable they would be. As Lindsay mentioned, this was one of the challenging ones for our advisory groups to evaluate, because this wasn't an implementation plan yet. It was deliberately left at the strategy and action level. And so there were comments related to that. But in addition to that, we did get generally positive or neutral responses as far as predicted outcomes. Noted was there's a potential for public support if bold action is taken. But again, concerns about the lack of specificity. And then there were concerns that the challenges associated with there being a current polarized environment. In terms of the timeliness, again, it was noted that the implementation pathways, really govern that, and there would be a dependency there. And then as far as the efficiency and effectiveness, there was some uncertainty expressed on a few fronts related to some of the technologies in the plan that may not be developed or at scale yet. And then similarly with policy outcomes, an example of that was, if there are voluntary versus mandatory implementation, there was some uncertainty that people expressed as far as giving a high positive outcome, because they were not convinced that the actions might actually realize change, depending on that. The next category is objectives for the economy. One thing I'll note here, and this actually I should note earlier for public health as well, is that the EPS tool that Allison is going to be presented on can predict some outcomes in some of these spaces, and that's going to be something that Allison will talk about, and that we can consider in conjunction with the expertise, the predictions based on the expertise across the advisory groups. So for the economy objectives, the 2 associated individual objectives were job creation and economic growth. Job creation, we got majority neutral or positive, very positive results. And we had something of a mixed responses for economic growth. Some of the comments that were noted was that there might be variability in the quality of jobs that were created. And so that nuance to job creation, not just being about numbers, but the quality of jobs. There was uncertainty expressed as far as the transition of the economy and the workforce. So that's not necessarily associated with a positive or negative outcome, more that the positive outcome would be closely tied to that transition and whether or not that could occur. And sort of a similar comment was along the lines that that transition might have negative short-term impacts and positive long-term impacts. And so that was a consideration to keep keep in mind that the predictions here were dependent on sort of time scale and when you were talking about. And again, really to that implementation question, there was an absence of specificity in how that transition would be executed, and that sort of again those cascading impacts, particularly thinking about equitable outcomes and what the impacts would be for communities and residents, and specifically those with varying educational backgrounds, would really depend on those details. The next category is our environmental objectives. And so there were two here related to preserving natural resources and ecosystem services, and then maximizing environmental stewardship. So we got generally positive responses as the most common response in both of these categories, although there were some noted, so there were some negative predictions with some comments associated with them on what that was associated with. So the benefits of renewable energy and other actions were noted. So essentially co-benefits that if you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, other emissions will likely be reduced as well. And there's environmental benefits associated with that. But there were several concerns noted about the potential impacts of CCUS specifically. Again, that implementation question is that the certainty of the prediction would be strongly dependent on how the implementation would occur, and noting that additional specificity would improve that. Specifically, it was noted that there was some specificity in the coastal zone as far as some of the actions that was not present in other, for other actions associated with other areas. And similar to what we've heard in one of the other objective categories, it was noted that there would be improved reliability of the prediction, so that the confidence in there being a positive outcome would be improved if there was related to metrics and tracking those outcomes. So it was noted that benchmarking and tracking emissions, other metrics, similarly with educational outreach and community engagement, that would improve the likelihood of a positive outcome. Then the last category of fundamental objectives is related to climate adaptation. So this is the other side of the coin. To reducing climate change is adapting where those changes do occur. Our two objectives associated with this were increasing the resilience of the built natural environment and increasing the resilience of communities. And again, our most common response was positive, but we did have some mixed responses in here. One was that there was enhanced resilience associated with emissions reduction. So especially, particularly if this could occur quickly, that some of the co-benefits of these actions would increase community resilience as well as environmental and natural systems and the built environment. Specifically noted were benefits of some of the actions to water quality and flood risk reduction. It was noted, however, that there were challenges of implementation that could pose a risk to those benefits. So, how confident, individuals were in those positive outcomes. Specifically noted were legal or policy concerns. Again, uncertainty in the reliability or effectiveness of some of the technological and industrial solutions in particular, and the threats that climate-related disasters pose, and the potential for there to be sort of feedback loops set up that some of the actions, are reliant on benefits that could then be put at risk in the face of things like storms or other climate change impacts. So I'm going to pass it off to Allison now and stop sharing my screen.
Great. I will pull mine up. All right. Can we see my screen? Great. Well, thanks so much. It's great to be back here presenting to the task force. I'm Allison DeYoung, a planner and policy researcher at the Water Institute. I'll be talking through our consequence analysis of GHG emissions reductions. And for this, we're using the Louisiana Energy Policy Simulator, or the EPS tool once again. We have mostly used it in its beta format, but it was launched to the public last week. And so you can go build your own scenarios in it online today, if you like. Energy Innovation and RMI developed this state level tool for us. The backend data are comparable, though not exactly the same as the GHG inventory produced by Dr. Dismuth at LSU. And as always, all the documentation is available on Energy Innovation's website. And if you have questions about the methodology for the tool, I encourage you to check there first, or to watch the webinar that we did last week with Energy Innovation launching the tool, and that's available online on YouTube. So I want to kick us off by talking about how to use this analysis to inform our decision-making. This is just one analysis. It's not a definitive picture or a yes or no answer on any of the draft actions. We have to interpret the inputs and outputs and make sure that we're using this tool to answer specific questions. EPS tools and policies, or EPS tool policies and our strategies and actions are not one-for-one equals. So this analysis started by crosswalking our actions to the policies available in the tool. And then to interpret the results, we have to think about whether we've done enough in our draft actions to achieve the modeled result. This bleeds into policy design a little bit, but that's what this analysis is designed to inform. So there are tons of uncertainties associated with this, but they're all useful to think through. In real life, we can't enact a policy just by switching it on. It's up to multiple entities to enact, fund, measure, regulate, monitor, maintain, et cetera. And so one of my goals with this analysis was to investigate relationships between policies, or look at how variations in implementation schedule or intensity could vary the outcomes. And for the full range of policy settings used for this draft portfolio, there was a tech memo distributed last week that has a table with all of the policy settings in the tool that we used to approximate for the draft strategies and actions in our portfolio. Okay, so let's look at the big picture. The portfolio as modeled reduces emissions to 95.1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2050. So this is a huge improvement from the BAU, the business as usual case, but it doesn't meet our net zero goals either in the interim or by 2050. And when we look at the sector breakdown, we can start to see why this is. Industrial emissions in gray are reduced to around 35 million metric tons, but this is offset by the new emissions from hydrogen production, which is the purple wedge on the top. Transportation in red and electricity in yellow, those look pretty good. So at a high level, we know that this, as we've modeled it, is not going to be enough to meet our goals. Electrification and fuel switching are creating a huge demand for electricity and hydrogen in this model, but this is producing hydrogen with current methods. If that hydrogen was produced with electrolysis, the emissions from the purple hydrogen wedge here would go down, but the electricity demand would go up even further. And meeting our electricity demand will probably require some additional policies around peak demand, transmission, and storage to make sure that adding more renewables to the grid will be able to meet needs 24 hours a day. So setting a strong, clean electricity standard is also critical to make this work. And if we look at jobs, implementing these policies would have huge benefits. Over 165,000 net new jobs, or technically new job years, so a job that lasts for an entire year. It would avoid over 1,800 premature deaths a year by year 2050, and avoid nearly 55,000 asthma attacks a year by year 2050. And those are using EPA numbers. Electrification and fuel switching create tons of jobs in this model. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. So let's look at some, So let's look at some breakdowns within the portfolio and find a few more interesting things. First, the electricity sector. For these breakdowns, I'm going to be comparing them to the US NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution scenario, which was built by Energy Innovation. It's a useful starting point to see if our policy trajectory is on track with a scenario that would put the US as a whole in line with the Paris Agreement. But it is a national scenario that's downscaled to Louisiana. I talk more about this in the tech memo, so I encourage you to go read that. In the electricity sector, the modeled draft portfolio shows a steady decline in emissions, but it's not quite as steep as in the NDC scenario. Some key differences are the timeline of the clean electricity standard. The NDC scenario has it at 100% by 2035 versus ours, which is 100% at 2050. They also ban new coal and gas power plants and subsidize renewable generation in a few different ways, using subsidies for solar and onshore wind, for example. Managing increased electricity demand is critical for meeting our emissions goals. Essentially, we have to move as much emissions as we can to the grid, and at the same time, drastically increase the capacity and renewable generation of the grid to power all of that with zero carbon energy. Electrification in the industrial sector moves industrial thermal emissions to the electricity sector. If the grid is still powered with gas plants, then there's no benefit to that shift. But if the grid is powered with renewables, then our emissions decrease. In the model, which treats Louisiana like an island, I think that's important to remember. This is a model that just looks at Louisiana. Generation will have to increase over fourfold to meet increased demand in this scenario that we've built. The bulk of the new generation is from distributed and utility scale solar. The y-axis on this graph on the right is actually terawatt hours per year. So distributed solar at the top is 70 terawatt hours per year by 2050. Utility scale solar, which is the bright yellow, that's 142 terawatt hours per year, et cetera. So that's the scale that we're talking about in terms of renewable production. It's just a massive increase. Meanwhile, early retirement of natural gas non-peaker power plants, that's the red in this graph on the right, those come offline, all of them by 2045 or so. And nat gas peaker capacity actually increases to meet the flexibility needs in this scenario. And when we look at that this is a policy-driven change in generation. So the x-axis here is the business as usual case, and these lines are electricity generation relative to the business as usual case. So this red line that dips below the x-axis, that is or both, below the zero line here. That's showing the natural gas non-peaker plants coming offline, while utility solar, offshore wind, distributed solar, and onshore wind see huge increases from the clean electricity standard and an offshore wind subsidy in the model. That subsidy approximates for the actions aimed at increasing offshore wind generation in Louisiana. So looking just at electricity sector policies and their relative contribution here, again, the y-axis here only goes up to 40 million megatons a year. So this is a really condensed graph here. We can see that the electricity sector CCS, which we specified in one of the actions, is resulting in a huge decrease in emissions, mostly from those nat gas peaker plants in the out years of this scenario. And we have that set at 95% to approximate the action language, which specified that 95% of emissions would have to be captured. The clean electricity standard is doing a lot here too that we can't necessarily see in this graph, because again, we increased demand fourfold and we've met it with mostly renewable generation. We also need additional grid flexibility to keep the model from building more peaker plants in the background. So that's something that the model just tends to do unless you make the grid more flexible. Okay, so let's talk about industry. Big picture, our track in red tracks really close to the NDC scenario. In part, that's because I used the same electrification and hydrogen and CCS settings as in the NDC scenario. The main difference here is just the lack of actions targeting F gases in our portfolio. These emissions are not the whole story, so I want to go into that further for you. So let's just look at industrial fuel use. Demand, which is in quads or quadrillion quadrillion BTUs per year. This is like a national or global scale of energy demand. It only reduces the amount of fuel demand to the level of the efficiency standards that we set, and which I think is 14%. So the electrification policies move that demand to electricity, and the hydrogen policies move that to hydrogen production. But we don't have any policies in our portfolio impacting hydrogen production currently, so those emissions are still out there from the current steam methane reforming methods of hydrogen production. And on the policy breakdown, CCS at the top in this dark blue wedge is applied to half of the process emissions only for chemicals, iron and steel, and cement. But as you can see, those impacts in terms of emissions reductions really pale in comparison to the electrification and fuel switching policy. The full settings are available in the tech memo again, but the percentage shifts were determined by energy. So the percentage shift to electrification by industry sector were determined by Energy Innovation for their national NDC scenario after reviewing data on electrification potential per sector from NREL and a couple other sources. But let's look at hydrogen specifically, because the NDC scenario also shifts hydrogen production to 100% electrolysis by 2050. So this bends their emissions curve for hydrogen back down to 0 by 2050, while our portfolio linearly increases with increased hydrogen production. The EPS tool doesn't include a policy on blue hydrogen, which may work well for Louisiana. And if we did shift all of this hydrogen production to electrolysis, that would increase the demand for electricity even further. I believe when I looked at it, it was 7-fold over the business as usual case. And so this raises a lot of questions about hydrogen, right? So in the spirit of analyzing our consequences, we took another look at this. Hydrogen is really critical to get right. You know, if we're spending all of this energy producing hydrogen, but it's not reducing our emissions, what if we didn't actually switch that fuel to hydrogen? What would happen to our portfolio? So we ran the scenario again, and the portfolio actually performed a lot better. It improved by 26 million metric tons by 2050. And so we know that hydrogen is critical for net zero, but the timing is really important to get right. So we tested some preliminary modeling, bringing the fuel switching on later after 2035, while bringing hydrogen electrolysis on a little earlier, starting at 2025 and hitting 100% by 2040. And that looks really promising, but more on that later. And I just want to say, this is why we analyze consequences, to try and find these relationships in the modeling that can inform our decision making. So I hope this is a helpful thing to see. And this is also probably a more realistic implementation pathway for the draft portfolio as it exists right now. So I think this is a really important slide here. On methane, methane is really important to get right. And to be honest, I don't think that these policies in the tool are the right fit for our methane policies. The draft portfolio performs similarly to the NDC scenario, but EPS doesn't have any policies dealing with legacy infrastructure or orphaned wells. In short, I'm really not confident in these results. And I'm also not sure that the baseline methane emissions in the tool are accurate, only because the science on methane measurement is changing so rapidly and new assessment techniques are being tested all the time. I think we've seen in the news too that a small leak can go undetected for a very long time and have enormous impacts. So methane is just really difficult to measure and it needs further study. And so I'm not super confident on evaluating these policies in the tool itself. In the transportation sector, the business as usual case already assumes some efficiency improvements. That's why the BAU line goes down, where in others they go up. The draft portfolio performs well, but not as aggressively as the NDC scenario, which has stronger electric vehicle sales standards. The bulk of the emissions reductions we see are from cars and SUVs. But while there's a lot we can do at the state level, some of this really needs federal action, and those kinds of federal actions aren't modeled here in this portfolio. We have some actions on freight that we couldn't precisely model. So I think this heavy trucks emissions picture would probably look better in reality, but I can't say for sure. On buildings, energy use, which is also measured in quads per year on the left, was not greatly impacted by the modeled policies, which again, you can see those settings in the tech memo. We do see a shift from nat gas to electricity, but it's not very drastic. And then just a couple notes on strategies with some minimal modeled reductions. This was mostly because these strategies require either local assessments that are in development, like with natural lands and carbon flux measurements, or they require very specific policy modeling that just isn't available in EPS, like some of the electricity and reduced carbon materials actions. Like utility green tariffs or Buy Clean Louisiana. We just don't have equivalent policies for that in the EPS tool. And I also want to touch on enabling actions and non-quantifiable actions. Some actions we can't quantify or model, but they are absolutely necessary to achieve the modeled impacts that we see in the portfolio. Many of those EPS policies require multiple actions to establish the regulatory or the business environment so that those impacts can be realized. And those are really important. Some actions are non-quantifiable right now, but we could improve them with a metric or a target. And some are more about how we achieve our emissions reductions. Colette spoke to that really eloquently earlier in this meeting. And so even though I'm here to talk about the numbers, just because something doesn't have numbers associated with it, doesn't mean that it's not critical in how we reach our emissions. So I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that too. So overall, we can see which EPS policies are driving the big emissions reductions. No surprise, it's electrification and hydrogen, with industrial energy efficiency standards and electricity sector CCS also providing some big chunks. And to wrap up, I think it's clear that our portfolio as it exists right now is not enough, but it's a really good start. And we learned some important things. The key story is increasing electricity demand and the importance of meeting that with renewable generation and a flexible grid. For fuel switching to be a key player here, the hydrogen production has to be, you have to abate the emissions along the entire chain of production for that to be worthwhile. As a brief comparison, here's that same sector graph for the scenario that we ran without the hydrogen fuel switching. The industrial emissions are just slightly higher, but there's no offsetting hydrogen production emissions, and the portfolio performs better overall. So I think this is actually a pretty good representation, better than the previous slide. And some key limitations here that I think are important to remember. On inputs, we have questions about methane, some detailed facility level data that might make it easier to assess specific policies, and land use carbon flux impacts. We also don't have policies in the tool on blue hydrogen, decommissioning orphan wells or wetlands, as well as some policies like Buy Clean Louisiana. And there are real limitations in how we can analyze and draw conclusions. Human behavioral change, exogenous impacts like hurricanes or pandemics, regional action and coordination, what future federal action might look like, changing global market trends, all of these are cause for huge uncertainties in the modeling. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Allison. We will have a long amount of time for Q&A on what Supi and Allison just presented on. But before we do that, I just wanted to share a few improvements that we wanted to offer to you all as the task force. Based on everything that we've learned through the EPS tool, we think that there are some key areas that aren't adding tons of actions to the plan because we already have a lot of actions that have been expressed, but really strengthening the goals that we have set forth. So I wanted to lay out 6 of those here for you, and we'll model them on the next couple of slides. But just a few of those actions that we can further identify and further strengthen from the draft portfolio. Again, just for discussion, wanted to bring this up before we break for Q&A. So in this first bullet, as Allison detailed really well, there is a very big benefit with blue and green hydrogen as those low carbon alternatives in heavy industry. And we had an action in the portfolio to explore what low carbon alternatives might look like. But we didn't specifically identify any tools or any one solution for that. And it's obvious through this analysis that green hydrogen should be brought into that and a nuanced approach, as Allison mentioned, with implementation schedule. Another thing that just really stuck out to our team is the obvious impact of electrification on industrial emissions. And this is not modeled in the tool, but it's necessary to strengthen our actions that help us enable large-scale deployment of electrification. So we identified a big need for incentives and likely some regulation as well to make that transition feasible through the action plan. Another one was raising and strengthening the clean energy standard to that NDC scenario, which was 100% by 2035. Our target was 50% by 2035, so this would be doubling that goal, which is very ambitious, but we saw that that had significant impact on emissions. Another action would be just strengthening the actions that we have around grid transmission, generation, and storage. In the tool, we can scale this up, and we did in our extended scenario that I'll show you all. But there is a real significance around ensuring that our grid can support this kind of widespread electrification, and that we're supporting and strengthening our regional transmission partnerships, because we cannot do this alone from Louisiana's perspective. Another improvement that we would offer is just increasing the percentage of CCS that could abate heavy industry process emissions. This is not necessarily turning on or retrofitting more CCS projects, though it might look like that, but better getting a handle on the capture rate that's possible with chemicals, iron, steel, as Allison mentioned, those specific areas that we turned on in the tool. So we would recommend, or we would offer up turning this to 75% instead of 50. And then lastly, a price on carbon makes a huge difference in the portfolio as we model it in the EPS. And just alongside all of these improvements that we could make, it's also very important to set goals and targets. We saw this in the non-GHG analysis and also in the GHG analysis, that having goals and targets will help us stay on track in meeting these goals, because a lot of our big improvements come a little bit later on, even after that interim target. Allison, if you can advance to the next slide. So we realize that these are tweaks that take our already ambitious actions and make them even more ambitious, which is why they're just improvements that we wanted to offer up. But they do really get us close to our net zero goal. This portfolio doesn't even include a carbon price, since that's out of Louisiana's control. We didn't just want to have one scenario with carbon pricing. But this comes from the extended portfolio, which is the orange line that you see here, as opposed to the red, which is the full draft portfolio. There's a huge amount of emission reduction between those two portfolios. And this would come from fuel switching to hydrogen and adding the electrolysis, the green hydrogen at full scale at 2040, increasing CCS on process emissions, fully implementing a clean energy standard or a clean electricity standard, and then increasing those components I mentioned, such as grid storage, demand response, and transmission capacity, to ensure that we can make that transition to electrification. So this drives down our emissions to about 20 million metric tons. So from 95 to 20, a huge benefit there, even though these are very ambitious goals. Allison, if you can go on to the next one. We also break it down by sector, so you can get a better handle on where those residual and outstanding emissions are. The industrial sector really benefits from these added actions around fuel switching, CCS, grid storage, and the other remaining emissions are still around agriculture, transportation, but much smaller than they were before. And then the last graphic I'll show you guys on the next slide is with a carbon price. This brings our emissions down to about 10 million metric tons with a $60 per ton carbon price that would be added in as a carbon tax. So wanted to model this one separate since we would rely on probably a federal or international carbon price. It's not in our control in Louisiana as the other things would be, but there's a lot of potential to reduce our emissions, not through adding many more actions, but just through strengthening some of the targets and goals that we had set forth in existing actions. And I'll hand it over to Charles to talk through some of the improvements that we could make based on the non-GHG analysis as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Someone go to the next slide too. Okay, great. So again, we're going back to the beginning, kind of where Supi was talking about the feedback on the non-greenhouse gas objectives, which was largely positive or neutral, but we still identified a handful of goals that we have for the next update to the portfolio based on the comments that we received. So the first one is that we need to clarify an implementation timeline inside the details for the actions. So, and we also need to ensure the prioritization of near-term action. So not only does this have implications for our overall pathway to decarbonization, but it also provides important priorities and details that can help promote public education and support for taking these actions in the first place. The second one is to include specific considerations for feasibility and implications for actions on downstream customers and ratepayers. And both of these concerns came up a lot. Feasibility clearly matters for obvious reasons, and so does how affordability is balanced with the implementations of some of these policies. So how and who pays for certain actions is going to be a really important thing for us to kind of think through as we move through this. The third was that to ensure the interconnectedness across sections of the plan so that we could maximize our co-benefits. So for example, we saw, and a lot of this discussion was about how interconnected the electricity generation is to our overall greenhouse gas successes in other sectors. And this kind of concept also applies to many of the co-benefits that were identified in this plan, like jobs in renewable energy or health benefits from cleaner air, from transportation or stationary emitters, and our ability to stay cool when the grid goes down, all these different things. We have to make sure that policies are linked so that the benefits stay linked. And so we're going to try to do that in the next round. And finally, to ensure that equity is intentional in action design with ongoing ways to track and measure progress. So here, the action portfolio can benefit from increased specificity, as we heard again multiple times from comments. So in some cases, there were intentions or mentions to include equity without details on how it would be done. And similarly, measuring and tracking progress will be another important aspect of all of this. So we can have goals, but if we don't think about how we can measure progress, there's less certainty that they'll be achieved. And so those are just a handful of the comments that we're going to be taking to heart as we go through the entire portfolio to make updates. And so now I'll hand it back to Lindsay and let her go from there.
Thanks, Charles. Harry, this is, Allison, you can stop screen sharing and we can go through any Q&A that people have.
Well, thank you, everybody. That was a lot of content and information, and so I know people are still processing, and you know, the intent is not to settle on any particular path. We just wanted to provide, I guess, first and foremost, the opportunity for questions. So the task force members have any questions, you can raise your hand, and we'll set aside some time for that. Ms. Pichon-Battle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my thanks to the presenters. That was a lot, but that was really, it was impressive, good. And I think I got at least half of what you said. So thank you. And also I saw that we got the technical memo that Allison, you referred to. So I feel like we can go back and look at some of this. So just thank you. It looks like great work. Just a couple of comments and then a question. As we were sort of honing in both on, I think, Allison's slides and some of Lindsay's slides around green and blue hydrogen, those feel very different. And as we go forward, it feels like we shouldn't conflate those two things so that we can just keep track of what the benefits are from green hydrogen, what the benefits are from blue hydrogen, because the other side of that is what the impacts are from both of them. And they're quite different, even though they're using a similar name. And I'm saying that just as folks try to figure out the technical pieces of this. And also looking at some of the slides just around some of Allison's slides, just around the impact of let's see, in industrial decarbonization methods. I just want to mention here that I think it shouldn't be lost on this task force that if public dollars are going to be spent, we should prioritize them based on their impact. I think Flozell has made this point. I know Professor Verchek has also, like, you see the small impact. You see how we have to do all of them together, but you also see the small impact. So can we think about how we prioritize public dollars for the greatest impact with all of these things working together? I think it's clear just from what we're seeing. I know we're still learning it and putting it all together, but that the requirement of industry to be reduced is just, it's just over and over clear. We're going to have to reduce industry to reduce emissions, to meet electricity demand. This is, if we're going to meet any of these goals, I think we still have to talk about how to do less. I know I keep saying that, and I'm not sure how it's falling on folks. And I don't mean it as a tension builder, but just as a place of innovation and opportunity that I think we still haven't quite reached. But to my question, I wanted to make sure that the data we're seeing, the question is whether the data we're seeing both in Allison's slides and Lindsay's slides, are these including the emissions from the permitted but not yet built projects? We've heard that comment many times through the public comment that there are several, I don't remember what the numbers were, but there are several projects emitting many tons of greenhouse gases that have been permitted. Are we looking at data that includes what is already permitted, or are we looking at data that like doesn't even include a whole other set of things? So that's my my last question. Thank you again to the presenters, very helpful.
Thank you.
And do any of our, does Allison, do you have any thoughts on the question relative to future emissions?
Yeah, this the business as usual scenario in this tool does not include those. So it was difficult we looked at whether we could do it, but because there's some uncertainty as to whether even permitted projects will get built or not, we did not have full confidence in adding those to the business as usual scenario. So this does not include future facilities.
As a follow-up for clarification, what is the assumption for business as usual for industrial emissions, even though they're not, I recognize they're not tagged to permitted facilities, but not yet built?
I believe in the BAU case, they go up steadily.
All right. Dr. Calavoda, and then we'll go.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple of points to make. Number one, I'd like to see a list of the strategies and actions that you could not model. That's the problem with these large scale models like this. You know, I think there's an opportunity to do some off model estimations of reductions. Maybe they're probably pretty small, but nevertheless, if you add enough of them together, it actually might add up to something significant. So anyway, I'd like to see those, and I've been doing this kind of work for decades now. So, you know, I think we can come up with something reasonable for those. So if you can provide a list of the things that you could not model, I'd appreciate seeing that. Secondly, I noticed that we are not pushing any growth in nuclear power. And if we were able to expand the amount of electricity we're generating from nuclear power, that would reduce the need for these natural gas peaker plants that would have to be built, because nuclear power runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You don't have to have the natural gas, as many natural gas peaker plants as you otherwise would if you have more of your power coming from nuclear energy. And that's also would help with the production of green hydrogen, I would point out too. So we need to look at that. The idea of a carbon tax, that is in conflict with one of our strategy recommendations, which was for cap and trade. And so I know that Secretary Brown's been working on that cap and trade scenario. If you can't have both, it's got to be one or the other. You know, I would defer to his judgment. Personally, I'm more in favor of the carbon tax, not the cap and trade. But but I'll defer to his judgment in that matter. But we can't call for both. It's either one or the other. We're either going to do cap and trade or we're going to do a carbon tax. And lastly, this idea of going to a clean energy standard by 2035, I'd like to see exactly what's in there, because our recommendation had an example of what a clean energy standard could be. I had some problems with the example that was given. I didn't care for it because it omitted nuclear, it omitted biofuels and things like that. So it depends, whether I can support going to that by 2035. I want to see exactly what the energy standard is that we're proposing. So with that, I'll stand down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Calavoda. And just to address on some of the questions you raised, Allison, is the list of what is not modeled or not capable of modeling, is in the technical memo?
Yeah, the technical memo goes strategy by strategy and talks about what policies in the tool were set to approximate for the actions in that strategy. And it talks about some of the gaps specifically. So if you have questions after reviewing that, I'd be happy to answer them.
And the carbon tax, was that an approximation because the tool is not capable of doing cap and trade? Or how is that?
Yeah, I think we had our action talked about a regional cap and trade system. And because the model is at the state level, it treats Louisiana like an island. And so we have a really tough time modeling any kind of regional systems or regional impacts there. We could set a carbon price to approximate for the cap, if we could do that math to get that in there. And it might be worth looking at. But in general, I think there are lots of additions to this analysis that we could do to try and quantify certain pieces. I think I would encourage the task force to think about how those would answer specific policy design questions that you might want to pursue, or if the fact that those questions are raised for you in the first place is indicative of a consequence that you would like to, consider in policy design. So I think there's just a question of utility of further quantification, or if we kind of know the general area that we need to head.
To further address Allison's response there, we are not recommending both a carbon tax and a cap and trade. I know that cap and trade was in the draft portfolio, and we modeled carbon tax here because it was very clear cut what a price would look like for Louisiana. But I envision that as we move into November, this would be a good point of conversation for the task force to discuss if we would want to put forward a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, since there are pros and cons of both of them. So just wanted to clarify, we're not proposing that we put both forward.
All right, thank you. And then relative to clean energy standard the pros and cons versus the different types of way to put a price on carbon, whether cap and trade or tax, let's certainly tee those up for discussion either later today or in our coming meetings. That's kind of some of the things that we're hoping to find some consensus on with the task force. And so Professor Burchick, I see your hand is up as well.
Yeah, hey, thank you. Just 3 quick points. One is, I think in doing the modeling and thinking about what success looks like, we need to think about enforcement and compliance. I think often in these policy planning stages, we tend to just assume that compliance is 100% with no reason to think that's true. If we think that compliance, if we're relying on very high compliance, then we have to have reasons to believe that, which means we have to be putting a lot of resources into enforcement and monitoring. Otherwise, we have to discount based on what we think the melt-off is going to be from compliance. The second point, which is to build on Colette's point, many of us have talked about the need to reduce production of fossil fuels and these sorts of things. In the quote unquote hallway discussions, what I sometimes run into are questions about, can that really happen? Because it seems like there's an idea that yeah, we can short suit ourselves, we can not produce, but then someone else is just going to produce it and it's not going to change demand. But I actually think empirically that's false. And there are lots of studies that I think we could look to. In other words, demand changing supply can affect demand, even if it's a single state. And I also think we shouldn't assume, because it's incorrect, that if we reduce production, other states won't also reduce production. I mean, I know it's a collective action issue, but we can see that other states are already gearing down in some ways for production, and that demand is changing. And so that if we can either reduce our production, we can affect demand. And the other thing is we can affect demand of what is consumed. If we decide not to make as much plastic for single-use forks and knives as we used to, and produce something that is a substitute for that too will change demand. So it's not as if we are sort of held hostage to the consumer. In fact, I would argue that it's probably the other way around. The last thing I'll point out is about the carbon fee and the carbon tax. I don't want to get too wrapped around the axle on that, except to say that you can have, I mean, there are actually carbon fee programs that look a little bit like cap and trade programs, and you also have the reverse. Washington State has what some people consider a carbon fee program, which also looks a little bit like a cap and trade program. What's more important is that it's done only by that state. So yeah, although it might be nice, and although planners in the state of Washington might be interested in getting involved in some kind of a multi-state or multi-province arrangement of trading, it's not a requirement. The state did it on its own. And if we were to have some kind of a carbon fee in preparation for joining whatever the regional cap and trade program is going to be in the Southeast or maybe somewhere else, then we would have that piece, and we could insert it when the time comes. The other thing is, people, is that carbon is floating around in the high troposphere, so we don't have to be members of a trading program in the Southeast. We can be members of RGGI. We could be members with California's cap and trade program. We could do deals with Quebec, right? I mean, so it's not as if we have to wait around for our geographical neighbors to get involved in this. We can get involved in it immediately. We could get involved in it in Glasgow by raising that possibility among some parties at the COP. That's all I got.
Thank you, Professor. And I see Bill Robertson, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. I have two quick questions for Allison. You used the phrase flexible grid. What do you mean by that?
I mean a grid with grid scale battery storage and other demand response capabilities, as well as increased transmission capacity to bring in renewable energy from outside state lines.
So that references the regional transmission organizations that our Louisiana utilities are members of, correct?
Yes, I mean, in the tool, you have the option to just increase transmission. So it's not recommending a specific policy implementation path for increasing transmission. That would be a policy design question. But in the model, the way it behaves is that you get increased penetration of renewables to the end user if you add things like increased transmission, demand response capabilities, grid scale storage, those kinds of things.
Okay, great. And my second question is, are we calling for a renewable energy standard in Louisiana to be adopted by our policymakers?
Yeah, that's one of the things we modeled, was a clean electricity standard. First, fully in the draft portfolio, fully implemented by 2050. And then in the revised one that Lindsay showed, we pushed that up to 100% by 2035.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the models call for 100% of our electricity in Louisiana to be derived from renewable sources by 2035?
In that second set of graphs that Lindsay showed, that was the policy setting that was included. Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a heck of a challenge.
Yes.
I just
Thank
want
you.
to clarify. So what was modeled was 100% renewables and versus 100% clean.
Yeah, and the model doesn't have the differentiation that that we had in our action. And so, you know, even as you saw, we did some early retirement of nat gas non-peaker and coal-fired and lignite-fired generation and brought those offline. But to meet the demand response the peak capacity, the model ended up building more peaker capacity when we did that. So nat gas peaker plants. And so we applied electricity sector CCS to those plants in the model to capture 95% of those emissions as was specified in the action.
To clarify, I think to get to Bill, your question. So in the draft portfolio, staff after reviewing comments and looking at other models around the country and world, we put forward a draft offering of by 2035, 50% of electricity would be renewable, 30 from clean resources, and then that means the other 20% unabated. And then by 2050, 100% would be renewable or clean, with 80% coming from renewable resources. And clean would include nuclear and CCS, or traditional fossil fuels with CCS. So that was just something to put out there and react to that is in line with what other states or localities are doing.
Sorry, and let me clarify, the policy in the model is actually a clean electricity standard. So specifying an increase in the fraction of electricity generation that must come from qualifying carbon-free sources like wind, solar, biomass, nuclear, hydro, and geothermal. So that's the standard in the model that we used.
We're not necessarily using the term renewable energy standard. We're using the term clean energy standard.
As drafted, took a page out of the City Council of New Orleans renewable and clean portfolio standard, just to capture both.
Thank you.
Yes, and to recognize, as Colette noted, the difference between clean and any other question?
The model ended up building a lot of renewable generation only because it builds, you know, in the absence of subsidies, it builds the cheapest available. So that's why a lot of utility scale solar got built in the model, because of price.
And is that also, Allison, do you have any visibility on, to Eric's point about adding nuclear, the price per, you know, I guess peaker plant with CCS versus nuclear, was that factored in and kind of the deciding point of why it added peaker with CCS?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think my understanding is that nuclear is pretty expensive to build, and so it's not going to add new nuclear capacity unless it's subsidized within the model. The model will choose to build cheaper forms of energy to meet that demand. So we could tweak that with policy settings if we wanted to simulate that.
And it's also, I think, understood, but worth repeating that it's hard to anticipate future prices on any of these technologies. And
right.
Certainly there's been a lot of hope around potentially modular and lower cost nuclear, but and that is being pursued, I know, at a national level, an international level, but price matters as well. Any other questions for our presenters?
Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Yep.
Thank you guys. One, I want to point out, just to reaffirm this question between clean energy and renewables, that was one of the questions I had. So if we could get a really tight list of what is included in clean energy and what its impacts are, that would be super helpful in going forward. Just a question about what assumptions are being made. Maybe this was covered. I hope I didn't miss it, but I'm wondering about the compliance. Where we mentioned compliance, what are we assuming? Are we assuming 100% compliance? How does that comport with past experience? Because I don't think we've ever been able to hit good marks on the compliance side. I wonder what impacts that has on the actual measurements inside of the tool. In addition to last week's discussion about CCS and what have you, I feel like there's some assumptions about what we can actually do, both inside of the industrial capture part of that discussion, as well as the larger greenhouse gas emissions that I'm not sure we've been able to see evidence for. I know this is a moving target and we're learning as we go, but we really want to be diligent about what's possible. So I don't know if, Allison, you have a sense of what's in those assumptions, or is that still emerging?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I'm glad that you're talking about enforcement and Rob is talking about enforcement. Like, I think these are the right questions, because something I talked about how I'm thinking about this consequence analysis is that, the policies in the tool do not allow, they're not telling you how to enact this or how to maintain it or how to enforce it. You can tweak the settings and assume a certain amount of loss or of non-compliance. But that, I think, is not necessarily it's not the way we approach the modeling. And I think it's because what I would recommend that we all do is think about on the back end, how do we actually go about achieving the modeled results that we just saw, and doing that backwards look at our actions and saying, oh, okay, is this really enough to actually achieve this? How have we thought through all of the, all of the pieces of the chain of this policy that would need to be enacted to be able to get this result? And enforcement, monitoring, maintenance, like those are all key pieces of that. And it's not something that we can necessarily, or that we want to be testing in the model, because I think the model is trying to help us answer a different question, which is which policies are going to have the biggest impact if we do it right. And we want to know, like, if we really do this, what's going to happen? And so I think there's some clear answers there from this modeling. Like, industrial electrification is huge and can get us some serious gains. We need to be thinking about electricity generation and demand. Like, those are really important pieces. And so now we have the question of policy design. Are our actions enough? Have we set out the right things? Do we have the right actions in place to be able to achieve that? So that's how I would encourage that we think about this.
Thank you, Allison. I mean, I think it's important to point out, though, something that was said earlier, maybe by Colette. How we actually do something impacts whether we get to achieve the goal. And so I still think there is a really important intersection. And so maybe there's a way to build out on the back end or in some other way for us to look at those really important issues around compliance and things of that nature, to see what we're assuming and what infrastructure on the governance side or on the public administration side need to be built in, and how to price for those things as well, so we can take that into account.
Yeah, the other thing I'll mention is that the tool is technology neutral. So there may be additional analyses or discussions like this that are going to be more important in terms of setting the direction than what the model can provide. And so I think that there's, that we also have all of our other fundamental objectives and that we've assessed the portfolio against qualitatively. And so I think it's important to use mixed methods in terms of getting to where we need to go.
It's a great point, Mr. Daniels, about how, what are we asking government to do? And if we're asking them to do more, do they need to be, you need to increase resources unless you're just expecting, I think in order to expect realistic additional capacity to carry out those additional missions. So point well taken. And we do have in the portfolio increasing capacity for our regulatory agencies as well. Any other questions for our presenters? I don't see any hands raised, but I will make the additional point. And the tool is good at what it does, and certainly has limitations. And treating Louisiana as an island is one of those limitations, or by design, intentional limitations. And I think we should all recognize, and we all do recognize, that we are not acting in a bubble, and that this is regional, national, international discussion. And so I just point out that while our portfolio doesn't have, I believe, anything on F gases, there is federal legislation in place to reduce F gases by, I believe, 80 or 85% by 2036. And so there's that we will have the benefit of that federal legislation, and certainly the national discussion around a price on carbon, or increasing federal regulation of methane are all we certainly need to have this dialogue with our federal partners and local as well. And as we are looking ahead to next week, having this conversation on the international stage. So anybody see the comments on the chat? Anybody want to raise their comments for discussion who've been making comments in the chat? Just want to make sure, give people the opportunity. Professor Verchick.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment, just a general takeaway from the portfolio. I mean, it's incredibly comprehensive, and a lot of people deserve a lot of thanks and gratitude for everything that they've helped put together. One of the takeaways, though, that I have is a lot of the language is work with the work with the Public Utility Commission or the Public Service Commission to persuade them to do such and so. Work with the legislature to persuade them to do such and so. Work with, and this language, it seems awfully vague, and in some cases, it seems implausible, frankly. To think that you go have a few conversations and lunch, and all of a sudden the Public Service Commission would say, yes, we're all in for a certain kind of a standard, or a certain set of practices, or a certain fee arrangement, or rate arrangement. And I just think it's important to recognize that skepticism that I think others have in looking at this. It's not going to be a matter of just gently persuading decision makers that something makes sense. There needs to be more of a game plan, and I'm not sure what it is, but I would like to know that people in the governor's office are working on something that is detailed and plausible and real. And I want to think y'all are, and that's work I couldn't imagine doing, but I just want to put it out there because I think it's really important.
Certainly, and this was the first cut of a draft portfolio, and I do want to set expectations realistically of these state level climate action plans. There's only so much detail you can provide. There's certainly only so much detail we can provide by February 1st, but that doesn't mean the conversation ends and the work ends either. I think you then move into implementing the plan, and I think that's where you get into some of the specifics of continuing the dialogue with our other branches of government, with our other executive branch agencies, commissions, recognizing that there are multiple levers, as you know, Professor Burchick, of state government and federal government and local government, and understanding various jurisdictions. And what I think it first starts with continuing to engage, recognizing that some of these branches of government or executive or agencies, or commissions have open dockets or have been, it's not that they haven't been looked at these issues before, and we want to understand sort of where their conversation has been, and engage on that level. So I think point taken that you need more specifics, but I think there's also just a level of how detailed can you get in a climate action plan of this nature. But if you have specifics, we would love to further incorporate them into the conversation. Ms. Pichon-Battle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just because I made a few comments in the chat, I'll just mention the clean versus renewable is a real distinction. It's something that we should all get very clear on, because it's a legal term of art used in federal policy and even being used at the industry level and at the state level and in litigation. So clean energy was coined to include, as we just heard from Allison, nuclear, CCS, a lot of things that are still polluting communities. They generate non-carbon based energy, but they are not clean in the sort of daily use of the term. If you want to talk about a non-polluting source or whatever, now you're getting into why people are making a distinction between renewable energy and clean energy. And I think it's important to hear, because the equity concerns, the justice concerns are actually against some of these non-carbon generating energy sources being called clean, because they still create pollutants that are not part of the climate conversation. And this is part of the deficiency in our work, right? We're talking about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we're focusing on carbon as though it's the only greenhouse gas. And we're leaving out all of the other pollutants, which is the environmental justice concerns. This is why the equity conversation comes into play. So I'm really glad that Mr. Robertson asked the question, because even from the comments in the chat, the task force members are not in alignment on what is clean and what is renewable. We could go further to justly source renewable energy. This is also a concern of where we're getting renewable energy materials from and how they're fueling not just more pollution in other places, but conflicts and other things. So it's not an easy, those two words, they seem so simple, clean and renewable. But they're not. They have a lot of political meaning to them. They have legal meanings to them. And every time I hear clean energy, I know I have to hear there are some polluting pieces in this, even though the carbon load is reduced. And it's just important, I think, that we get clear on that, especially in our portfolio and as we advance solutions.
Fair point. And I do want to recognize we tried to be as transparent as possible in this draft portfolio and defined clean generation as generation that emits little to no GHGs, for example, nuclear, biowaste, natural gas with carbon capture, et cetera. So certainly point well taken. And I think depending on who you ask, they'll give you a different answer on what clean is. And so making sure that we are all on the same page in understanding and defining our terms is critical as we look to land this climate action plan in January. All right, I don't see any additional questions or comments from the task force. So Lindsay, would you pull up the slide deck again? Just you have some questions for discussion, although we've kind of already started to get into it, but taking a page out of Heidi Stiller's playbook in our
Wait,
Go ahead.
First, we're gonna go through the input received and then do.
Oh, that is correct. Okay, let's go ahead then. We'll try to reserve some time
Really
for the
excited.
discussion, although we already started. Go ahead, Lindsay.
There we go. Okay, so alongside of the incredible work through the consequence analysis, before we dive into a discussion by the task force on the advantages and potential concerns of the portfolio, wanted to give you guys the full picture of all of the input that we've received alongside of the advisory group feedback. Also wanted to share with you more specific to strategies and actions and their technical wording and feasibility. We received a lot of comments from you all, from our public, from sector committees, and from our state agencies. Nearly 100 comments total is what we had received. So today, Charles and I are just going to highlight for you at very high level the feedback and opportunities and concerns raised in each of these key areas of feedback. So we organize them not as explicitly as each section of the plan, but around the key areas where we received focused feedback. So that's around the energy system, industry, a price on carbon, infrastructure, the economy, transportation and land use, and then lastly around lands. But before diving in, I wanted to highlight just a few key takeaways that we saw across all 100 comments that we received. There is an extensive funding need, as many of you mentioned, on the task force, not only to support our state agencies, but also to support our jobs and economy in this transition. We need to make sure that we're accounting for that in the plan and that we're making space for where we can find more funding for those needs that are presented. Another takeaway that was raised around economic implications alongside funding is also potential downstream impacts to ratepayers and customers. This was raised by industry, but also by community members that of potential impacts on the utility rates that they pay and products that they consume. And additionally, we've talked about both of the next key points about an implementation timeline, detailing near-term priorities, bringing that down to what does this time scale look like in terms of our emission reduction goals. Kind of going along with that is feasibility, ensuring that there is room for partnerships, but also direction by the state on what is feasible and what might be more of a stretch or a reach, which goes back to the priorities and timeline as well. And a point raised by Professor Burchick just a moment ago. Building upon ongoing work that's been happening at the state level, but also with our local partners, and also at the federal level too. We could expect a clean energy standard at the federal level. So what should we do as the state to either prepare or position for that? And lastly, another big takeaway was around uncertainty of existing or additional authorities. Can agencies actually do this at the state level? Can local partners do this? Is this in the federal jurisdiction? So better defining the lane of what authority is needed or existing to execute the actions that we have provided in the draft portfolio. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the portfolio will change based on the feedback that we received and based on our conversation with you all today. Aspects that we intentionally left out will be added in, and we'll be developing a matrix that helps set these near-term priorities, and will be transparent as possible as we make these revisions and produce a revised portfolio next month. And you'll be able to all view that before the next task force meeting and how we're making those revisions. So now I'll hand it over to Charles to talk through feedback around the energy systems at a high level.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. And just again, this is a reflection of the feedback we received. So you may not agree that the opportunities are opportunities or the concerns are concerns, but we wanted you to kind of see a bigger range of what came out. So this section is going to cover kind of both the electricity generation side and methane emissions together. And so some of the things that we heard from the feedback is that the energy system changes are obviously crucial to emissions reductions goals. We heard that renewables will be cost competitive, and so this is already underway to a degree. That changes to this system benefit not just greenhouse gas goals, but also long-term sustainability and other climate goals that we've identified. And there's the potential here to provide benefits to low-income residents with small changes to the action. So tax incentives aren't always the best approach, and we saw some feedback on kind of some real specifics there. And then especially on the methane side, federal funding could be an opportunity that we could take advantage of. We also heard concerns such as, and I think we've heard a lot of this already in the discussion today, such as just getting buy-in from the Public Service Commission, other issues related to jurisdiction, especially as it pertains to kind of methane, the definition of clean energy, as we know that that's a concern from today. We also heard just concerns about maybe the efficacy of energy efficiency being a priority in certain areas, extensive costs, which Lindsay talked about, and those costs again have implications for the potential to be passed on to ratepayers, or the concerns about keeping Louisiana's economy competitive, and then again also to the potential for redundancy with federal action, kind of us picking the wrong set of numbers when the feds come out with another set of numbers afterwards. So those are some of the things we heard on the energy system side. So Lindsay, you can do the next one.
So in industry, also a wide range of feedback we received. There was preference for market-based mechanisms over regulation, and then there was preference for regulation over incentives. So we did try to balance the feedback that we received and represent that for you all here to see both sides of feedback we got. As we saw today through the analysis, someone beat us to it and showed that there was needed emphasis for electrification here. There's potential to produce new jobs and economies that pose fewer human and ecological risk, and the opportunity for Louisiana to lead the nation in green industry. That was represented across a wide range of feedback, as there's a real opportunity for Louisiana to be a leader here. There were concerns, though, as we expected, around the industrial actions. So greater requirements for industry could be transferred as cost to ratepayers and customers, which I noted was an overarching concern across a variety of sections of the portfolio. Another concern raised is that the variety of size, type, and location of facilities requires complex action. It's hard to take these broad strokes for all of our various industries. We have a lot of small and medium-sized industry, which is very different than our larger size industry. And we have chemicals, but we also have petrochem and some steel and coal as well. So there's a lot of variety that we need to keep in mind as we're developing action. Developing new frameworks and permitting, which gets into infrastructure. This could be cumbersome for industries as they're implementing and working through the new frameworks. Another concern raised was around feasibility. How rapidly can we deploy renewables and CCS technology to meet our goals? Is it feasible to deploy as soon as our 2025 and 2030 targets? Other concerns were around regulatory hurdles in deploying and using renewables, getting back to a similar point that Charles raised around buy-in from the Public Service Commission. And then continued concern over carbon capture and storage was expressed as well around industry. Charles, back to you.
Okay, so as was mentioned, the portfolio contains a price on carbon through a regional cap and trade system, and so there was some discussion about that in the comments. And so on the opportunity side, we heard that there is support for market-based national or international price on carbon. We also heard that people felt a carbon tax was more effective and less administratively cumbersome than a cap and trade system. People thought that an economy-wide mechanism is more effective and comprehensive than an industry or utility-specific price on carbon. And then an opportunity was that the role of offsets and the use of revenue from credit sales could add value to our ecosystem and economy once they were properly actually identified. Some of the concerns expressed on this topic were that carbon pricing is just inherently complex and must be thoughtfully planned and executed. Much more detail was needed on how allowances would be allocated or tracked or reported and accounted for under a cap and trade system particularly. And then just the recognition that cap and trade provides allowances for pollution to continue, which allows for impacts to fence line communities to also continue.
On infrastructure, there was a lot of great feedback here. Opportunities exist, such as relying on our regional transmission. As we talked about on the GHG slides, this is essential in our future grid demand that we see coming. Other opportunities similar to the energy system slide, our early pilot projects can be prioritized in underserved communities. Again, those small tweaks to actions could help bring that focus more to underserved communities. There's potential to reduce methane through fugitive emissions and legacy infrastructure pretty immediately through a lot of proposed federal action and funding that we see coming down. Again, more broadly around infrastructure, federal funds are available if we have the appropriate advocacy for drawing down those funds. There's also potential for positive impacts on historically disadvantaged and frontline communities if we're taking this more nuanced approach to our permitting and siting of facilities, as we talked through in the action plan. Also prioritizing capacity of agencies to execute actions. This was something that Flozell and Rob both mentioned as significant to ensure that when we're setting forth these actions and modeling them, we're ensuring that our agencies are able to execute them. Other concerns that were raised around infrastructure was a lack of detailed and explicit implementation pathway in these actions, which we entirely agree around that. Level of stakeholder engagement and updating permitting and siting plans. As was mentioned in the portfolio, the proposed interagency panel would be just that, interagency. And there's an ask to integrate more of a community perspective, more an industry perspective into that. There is uncertainty of existing processes and specific areas of improvement. So this gets back to the lack of detailed pathway. What exactly are we trying to tweak or change in the siting and permitting, and building on that uncertainty in existing jurisdiction rules. There's potential negative impact of future infrastructure in marginalized host communities, just through the perpetuation of putting this infrastructure on those frontline communities. So it was interesting to see that there's potential positive impact on those frontline communities, but also potential negative impact that was offered to us. And lastly, the development of new frameworks and permitting could be cumbersome. I had shown this on the industry slide as well as on this one because it was reiterated by other stakeholders, even outside of that specific industrial decarbonization context.
Okay, when it comes to the economy and changes to the economy, some opportunities identified were that some of the workforce development programs that were in the portfolio in solar and offshore wind could be expanded to include other sectors such as low and no carbon fuels, onshore wind, carbon utilization, and others. We saw that employment is going to be available in a wide range of environmental sectors as well. We heard comments to the effect that there's a value in investment in locally owned firms rather than large regional or national firms coming in to do this work. And there was potential to build on federal level investments or programs such as the Climate Corps. On the concern side, one of the first ones we heard and wanted to point out is that community welfare is not limited to just the economy, but needs to include other important aspects like health and well-being of people. And there are more tools than tax incentives. So the state should also consider mitigating burdens placed on communities to attract investment. And then finally, that there should be clarification on the existing role and programs of the Workforce Commission, for example, and where the actions in the portfolio are actually providing new value, or are they being duplicative with services that are already being provided by government agencies.
As we transition to transportation and land use, some opportunities that were presented under this section, because as a reminder, we looped transportation, built environment, and land use all into one section. So we're providing this feedback across those various sections or across those various areas in that one section. Opportunities exist here. It was encouraging to hear that it's transformational for underserved communities and low-income families to have access to broadband and to regional transit to bring them to and from their jobs, but also to access broadband in their homes. There is an opportunity if we make an explicit connection across vehicle miles traveled, regional transit, and the land use actions, that it will make all of these actions more effective. So in the draft, we kind of separated the transportation and land use, but there's an opportunity to connect those better and make all of our actions more effective. Another opportunity is to highlight the ongoing work of existing organizations to deploy electric vehicles and plan infrastructure projects. There's a lot of exciting work that we heard about through the comments and want to bring that to light and raise up the work that's ongoing across the community already. And also comments raised around how land use planning is integral in community resilience. So all the work that the state's doing around resilience, land use planning will make that even more comprehensive. Concerns that were framed in this section were that VMTs don't address the miles traveled by boats, planes, and helicopters. We do see there is kind of a gap on addressing some of those miles traveled on those non-vehicular miles. There was also a request for actions that monitor induced demand, since VMTs only work with land use and regional transit. So understanding better the induced demand from the projects that we're building. There were requests on some sides to say only electric vehicles, and then from other people to say just alternative fuels. So there was that differentiation, again, kind of similar in the clean conversation. There is a lack of authority and resource for increased funding for rural transit and for land use planning at the state level that would make implementing some of these actions a challenge just across the board. It's not only resources, but also authority. And there was also a concern around the purpose and need for land use planning at the state level. So again, an interesting parallel of feedback where it's a huge opportunity to bring land use planning into community resilience, but also a question around how do we need this and what is the intended purpose, the specific need that exists there, which we saw on a lot of different actions.
And the last section that we're going to review today has to do with kind of the lands side of the portfolio. And so some of the opportunities were that there's a lot to be done with the use of geospatial data analysis. That'll support a lot of the actions in that plan, part of the plan. We can use goals to ensure that forested areas are preserved and increased. There was generally widespread support for wetland preservation and restoration as a carbon sink and further good benefits. There's widespread support for best management practices and the transition to regenerative practices in agriculture and forestry. And again, kind of has come up, urban tree canopies, green spaces, and agriculture offer multiple benefits for communities, and that was raised as an opportunity there. On the concern side, we heard that there was not sufficient incentives or enough encouraging of farmers to remove marginal lands from production. There was not sufficient detail or concrete kind of enforcement mechanisms here. So we had voluntary programs sometimes, or there was a lack of specificity in other cases. And then finally, that there are equity concerns that need to be addressed on both the coastal and the forestry and agriculture side of this issue that were not adequately addressed. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I think we'll turn it back to you and have that discussion on the bigger topic.
Thank you, Charles and Lindsay. Appreciate going over just a summary of all the input that we got from our committees and the public. I guess I will offer an opportunity. Any questions relative to those? I mean, it's a pretty overarching summary, so I don't want to get too nitpicky, but I will offer that opportunity. Seeing none, as I mentioned, we'll kind of follow the same procedure as we have in the last couple meetings. So if you would, we're going to try and grapple with these two questions over the next 25 minutes or 30 minutes or so. First, we'll focus on what does the portfolio in its draft form get right? So take a minute, write down your thoughts, and then share those thoughts, and then we'll start a discussion, and then we'll move on to where the biggest needs for improvement are. And some of this I recognize we'll be picking up on some of the comments already made. So as you're thinking, just once you're done, share any comments or prompts in the chat, and then we will use that to steer our conversation. And you can focus on in general overarching themes or anything specific that you think is whether at the right level or just as a good policy. And so we will start. Colette, do you want to share your thought?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just thinking that I really appreciated Allison's slides because to see it all together was just clear that, you know, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot of different things moving at one time. And, you know, there are many of these options that I don't appreciate, but I get the scale of the problem. And so I think prioritizing where we're spending public dollars and what we're putting first. And I think some of the public comments that have said, you know, what's available now versus what's going to take 10 or 7 or 15 years to get going, that really comes into place. I think the biggest need for one of the needs for improvements, I just keep thinking about understanding these numbers and these graphs without the current permitted projects. Like, it feels like a big hole in our process here. Because even if we do all of the work of negotiating this to a place of agreement, if we're not looking at what's already permitted and what's going to come online, I just think we're going to get the numbers wrong. So those are just two things that really stood out for me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good points, and certainly making sure that the tool captures as much as it possibly can, and then recognizing what it can't or does not capture is critical to helping inform our decisions. And so certainly need to be as clear and transparent about that as possible. Professor Chambers, do you have a comment?
I just thought that the portfolio does a good job of identifying the basic types of policies that we have to undertake in order to achieve the maximum benefit, especially, you know, identifying industrial electrification as an area that will yield large benefits compared to others. And it also, I think, was useful in identifying the shortfall between the governor's goals and what can be expected without a portfolio that's extended even beyond what was previously suggested. So I think it does some things good.
Professor, and I think in I believe it was Lindsay's slides addressing we have a lot of the actions kind of on the table. It's a question of how quickly you implement them and at what scale. And so that's a question of what are some of those interim targets of implementation to get us there. That changes the story very, very much once you dial into that. Anyone else on policies or components of the portfolio or overarching themes that you think that you like in the current draft that you wouldn't want to change, for example, as we look to further refine? Eric, I see your hands up.
Are we covering both questions 1 and 2 or just 1?
I was trying to focus on the first one. Start positive. Go ahead, and then move to areas for improvement. But
okay, I'll just say that I think that the portfolio does a good job of it's comprehensive. I'll say that. I think it covers just about everything. The level of detail in certain areas, I'll save that for question number 2. But I think we did a good job of covering all the potential areas of actions we could take. So I think we're there. It's just a matter of maybe improving on some of the elements of it.
Certainly, and getting more focus where we can, and then also prioritizing, as we've heard several of our members say today, because that comprehensive list of 100 actions where do we focus time and energy and resources towards? Jonathan, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I agree with the comments made so far. And I think it outlines those high level, guidepost strategies that we can go forward with and dig in, right? But I mean, at this point, I agree with Colette that it's going to be multifaceted. We're going to have to use all the tools in the tool bag, and this is outlining those tools. Implementation of each tool, could take a lot of time, and probably more time than we have to really dig into each one. But it provides the parameters that we can go forward with and get into those details with the appropriate authorities who can manage the implementation. I think it gives us those good strategies moving forward at the right level.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yep.
Rob.
There are a lot of great things in this portfolio. I just want to call attention to two things that I think are basically non-negotiable if we're serious about getting to the target. I mean, two things that we absolutely need. I'm sure they're going to be in what we recommend. What I'm not sure is whether there's a political appetite to implement them. But one is that renewable green energy standard, and the other one is cap and trade, some cap on carbon or some fee on carbon. If you don't have the cap or fee, and if you don't have that renewable green energy standard, none of this is going to happen. You can't get the reductions at scale, and you won't get all of those huge benefits in terms of job, expanded economy, and everything else. That just seems to me to be pretty clear in the literature. So those two things have to both be job one, I think, in addition to all the other fine things that people are saying and that are in the portfolio.
Rob, those are certainly some of the bigger ticket items that can move the needle significantly, but also face challenges in implementation. Prioritize.
Your connection's cutting in and out, Harry.
Apologies. Just to saying yes, we need to those are big ticket items that we need to that can move the needle significantly, but that will face potential challenges in implementation, and so perhaps an area to prioritize efforts, recognizing that additional efforts may be needed there. And Jeff, I see you made a comment in the chat. Do you care to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's pretty high level, and I guess it touches on question 2 as well, so we can save that for that discussion. But I think couldn't agree more with everybody's comments, and I also thought that it did a very good job, even though obviously portfolio isn't explicitly talking about these issues. I think all of our previous discussions about sort of centering equity in the communities who are most impacted by the different options that are on the table. I think having sort of this multi-pronged approach, I think does a good job of keeping that at least implicitly in this portfolio discussion. So I was happy to see that. I can save my second comment, but I think if anything, when Charles ran through, the different sort of areas and where we might improve thematically, just from an economic development perch, I would just urge us to treat this like the moonshot moment that it is. And I think, we've all talked about it, throughout this task force, but I think, this is a singular moment to look at the opportunities that do exist, however painful they might be in an energy transition, and to really, as Professor Verchick was just saying, make the hard choices, because that is where the economic growth actually lies in the coming decades. And so we need to be able to do those things. And I would just put those in the opportunity column. I think we need to keep those at the forefront. So just two quick thoughts.
Thank you, Jeff. And certainly we'll need to continue the dialogue with local governments as well. And City of New Orleans, for example, being a leader, already having an action plan and a renewable and clean portfolio standard. So opportunities to learn and kind of build upon and collaborate with.
For sure. I've been holding my tongue because it wasn't appropriate at the level of conversation we're at, but I certainly am going to be reaching out about, microgrids and some grid changes that we're contemplating locally, and want to fold that into the conversation with your team, Harry.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Camille, did you have anything? I see you dropped a note in the chat that you wanted to elaborate on.
Yeah, I just I'm very proud of the entire task force and everyone that's contributed and where we are right now. I think it's an excellent first shot at a climate action plan. And it just strikes me as interesting that we're going to get the most out of moving to renewables, but we're furthest behind in the United States in our renewable sector. And so it would be, in the next iteration of when we move to figuring out more detailed actions around the timeline, prioritizing resources and how all of this rolls out, really understanding that component. I like the comments about a regional approach and making sure that the renewables not only can come from other places, but eventually we can export those as well, that energy. And so I think there's a huge opportunity in this space, especially to create an entirely new ecosystem for entrepreneurs and new businesses and new technologies. And so I just wanted to lift that up as what I see as a future that I would want my children to be part of, and moving to that cleaner energy, harnessing the power of natural systems. And then just in the biggest need for improvement, like I said, this is the first iteration. And so I'm glad to see that there is a focus on accountability, monitoring, solidifying this task force, to be put into law, and that we continue to meet over time. Because if we don't continue this discussion, if we don't ensure accountability and work through together these problems as we move forward, we'll never reach these goals. And so I'm eager to stay involved and engaged and part of this. So thank you, Harry and the team, and Lindsay and Charles, everything that y'all have done. I'm proud to be part of this.
Thank you, Camille. And it's been it's wonderful to see so much engagement from not only our members and committee members, advisory group members, but also the public as well. So there's been a lot of input in shaping this draft where it is today, and will continue to be as we move forward. To your point about renewables, certainly, just reviewing since our last meeting, the International Energy Agency's net zero pathway, which is just one pathway, but from a pretty significant authority. They say that renewables, I think specifically wind and solar, have tripled over the last decade, and they will need to triple from where we are today by 2050. So that is a tall order, but it's been done before in terms of that type of growth. And by contrast, Louisiana, if you include our hydro and solar generation in the state, it's about 2.5% of generation. The national average is about 21 or 2% today. So certainly an area to ramp up renewable generation in this state. And so with that, appreciate everybody's input. And so let's move to our next question. Where is the biggest need for improvement? And so what would you like the planning team to focus on as we look to update this draft and recirculate it for review between now and our next meeting? So take a minute, share in the chat, and then raise your hand. All right, Bill, I see your hand is up, but folks keep submitting your comments. But Bill, go ahead.
Thank you, Harry. A lot of the outcome of this task force is going to be a pretty big lift for the people of Louisiana. And I'm wondering what our documents say about bringing the public along with us. I'm wondering what the staff in particular intends to do in terms of selling this document to the public. And finally, with a big lift like this, with a heavy task, it seems to me like if we ease people into it, might make the task easier. So I'd like to see some regular commentary, either from you, Harry, or various members of the task force going out to the public about what we're doing, so that when we finally have a document we can present to the governor, it's not a complete shock. So that's my comment.
Great point, and something that we know can never do enough of is public engagement. We've tried to cast a wide net of folks officially engaged, over I think 145 people participating on the committees, advisor groups, and task force. And certainly governor's office can take the lead in socializing what's in the drafts, and then we will have another public comment period for the updated iteration of this portfolio that Lindsay will provide dates on as we close up this meeting. So that's something that further engagement, and really I think it is not just us, that we need everybody to be raising this with their own colleagues, groups, affiliations, and so that this is a team effort to get input as well as buy-in. But point well taken, and we certainly look forward to continuing that effort and ramping it up as we look to land this draft plan. Any other comments, Eric?
Yeah, thank you. As far as moving forward, I guess I want to follow up with what Bill was saying a little bit too, because I have my own feelings about that as well. That we have a certain culture and attitude in this state, and that's reflected in the elected officials, both state elected officials and local elected officials, in the Public Service Commission, et cetera. And so we need to look at what are the items in the portfolio that are going to be most popular and visible. And one thing that I was a little bit disappointed in the portfolio is the amount of attention we gave to natural sequestration. And yeah, it might be a small percentage, but it's highly visible to the public. Tree planting in people's yards and businesses, convincing businesses to give up some of their parking spots and put in trees, and maybe taking clearing adjudicated properties and reforesting those. That's a very highly visible, and I think in this state would be very popular thing to do that a lot of people would be supportive of. And, the things that are not as visible to the average person, may not have much will behind them to get them done. So I think there needs to be a level of political reality or popularity associated with each of these. And we need to think about that. And the other thing too is the most immediate thing we can do, and it's not really clear in the way the portfolio is organized perhaps, but is efficiency. That's the first and easiest thing to do, is to try to improve efficiency across the whole landscape. And so if we can emphasize those as the early wins and the things that really don't cost a lot to implement, matter of fact, it might save money over the, for business and industry and also the public, just promoting efficiency, I think is a big win for us. So those are my comments on where we can maybe make some improvements to the portfolio.
Great points. And I think the actions are in there, but I think more emphasis or is an opportunity certainly for that low hanging fruit. And you don't have to tell me about increasing sequestration, natural sequestration, and the eco benefits there.
Yeah, I just and I'll be quiet after this, but maybe we could organize it in sort of an implementation strategy. Here's the short-term things, here's the medium-term things, here's the longer-term things, because they're all intermingled right now, and you have to go in and distinguish them for yourselves right now. But I mean, if we could organize it that way, it might help.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Certainly, right now it's organized by theme, and so things can get lost. And so certainly in terms of readability, accessibility of the actual plan and what's in it, and then kind of thinking through prioritization. Certainly there's areas for improvement on that. And I think the layout we can work with the layout to maybe tease out some of those prioritized actions so the reader fully understands what those are. And Colette, did you have a comment that might dovetail on?
I was just agreeing with Mr. Calavoda. The efficiency is great for equity. Some of these other things we're going to have to fight it out. And I recognize that we don't all come from the same perspective, but efficiency, saving our trees, saving our swamp, these are, when we ask the community what they love, that's what it was. It really was those things. And for all of the tension we're going to inevitably have, I think to get some wins for all of us on the early side. And I really like what Mr. Calavoda said about, short-term, medium, long. I think that's right. I just think it's a smart move. There's a lot of money being put into people's fears and people's lack of knowledge and people's lack of education. And we have a really poor education system in our state. And we're trying to do this moonshot, as Mr. Jeff said, it's hard to do a moonshot with an uneducated population. It's hard to do a moonshot with folks who do not understand or get hours of specialists talking to you about technical capabilities. And so we're gonna have to get the public with us. And there are things that they agree on. They love the swamp. They love the trees. They love these natural resources. They love saving money on their bills. There are things we could do before we get into the tougher things. There are things we could do and win together. And I think our state right now, just in where we are, we need the political will can shift if we show some courage around being able to move together. Maybe not on the things we disagree with, but on where there's agreement, we should really highlight that. So just agreeing with Mr. Eric's comments.
Yeah, great point. And we want to hold up those areas of consensus in particular, recognizing that that's where you can get the most action immediately, and that we are trying to create an action plan, not just a plan. Terry, you made a comment. Would you like to share?
Yeah, sure. The thing that I'm seeing, and I know this is all part of the process. We're not to the end yet, but the thing that I'm seeing is that we're identifying the big picture strategies that we're going to need to address and the directions we're going to need to go. But we still have these 100 some odd very detailed action plans that were proposed. And we've just put all of those into big buckets and said, we're going to do all the things for converting to, 100% renewables in our electricity sector by a certain date. And then there are all these ways that we could do it that are possible ways to do it. And at some point, I feel like we need to do a mapping between the big strategies and all the action plans and decide which ones, we're going to have to down select from some of those, many action plans. We're either going to have to down select or we're going to have to combine some of them into some actual policy proposals that will come out of this. Because at the end of the day, what I hope comes out of this whole process is that we actually do something. If all we do is write a report that gets put on a shelf, I will be very sad that we went through this whole exercise.
I think you speak for many of us on that point. And so being smart about prioritizing and understanding what can get done is certainly part of the conversation. Flozell.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to echo a lot of what's been said and to emphasize my comment last week. And there have been so many meetings, I forget which one, but this idea of really starting to align. There's so much information emerging from the inventory, from the EPS tool, from the amazing reports and presentations that we're getting, that we can start to think about how do we build a model for sort of best bang for the buck, starting to interface with where we think subsidies and financial incentives and other financial supports for these actions, not only where they will come from, but how we can amplify those. And then match it with our best opportunities to not only reduce the GHG emissions, but as Colette and others have pointed out, to also have a positive impact on these other impacts, if you will. And so I think just along the pathway, it would be really great for us to start to drill down on what does that look like, so that as a task force, we can interrogate and debate and really push through some of what it means to offer recommendations that speak to where investment should go, not only the kind of investments we should be making, so that we can get there. The other thing I'd love to mention that we can pick up later is where any and all of this intersects with disaster resilience at the system level. So we often talk about resilience as an individual thing. I'm talking about systems level disaster resilience and where these strategies intersect by way of energy production and strengthening the grid, the saving of lives, and all the things that we saw in Hurricane Ida, quite candidly, from Louisiana to New York. I think there's some real opportunities for us to think about how those investments in people can be manifested at the systems level in a way that gives us not only the best bang for our buck in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and protecting our communities environmentally, but also making systems more responsive to what people need in the oncoming disasters.
Great points. And just so I understand your first point relative to, we're saying kind of understanding the context of, I mean, for example, where there are already federal subsidies or kind of the interplay of regulation and funding and price, and understanding sort of what is the rate of implementation of the various different actions, and then today without any action, and to understand where to prioritize or what's not moving fast enough that really should move faster. I think you said it more articulately than I did. I'm just trying to.
I'm speaking to something that's probably more simple than what you're describing, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Just in my experience, in 20 plus years of policy work, eventually there is going to be budgets attached to any and all of these things, and conversations about where those resources come from, what's realistic and what's not. And what I'm pushing us to do is to do a really honest and tough job of thinking about how we assign available resources to the things that are best going to achieve what we need to achieve that's emerging in this plan and the actions that we want to take, right? And that really matches, I think, with everything else we've heard from Jeff, Colette, and others about let's make sure we're prioritizing not only what people want to see and need to see, maximizing these efficiencies like Dr. Calavoda and others have mentioned, but really making sure that we're not going to have enough money to do everything. And then also maybe having an unusual discussion about how we rally to go get the resources we need, even if we don't have them. That's possible also. So I'm just trying to make sure that as we build this emerging model and set of recommendations, we're taking that into account, because it's going to be devastating for community if we don't do that hard work and then find out we're making really great recommendations for which we don't have a means of implementing. I really want to have some discipline around that.
Great point. Thank you for clarifying. That is part of the effort and can be a focus as we move over the coming months to finalize and to, as several of our members have said, prioritize, clarify where we want to focus our efforts, particularly, I think, over the coming couple years. But the goal was to provide a broad scope to get us on the pathway, but then narrow it down to kind of think through implementation and where we prioritize. So thank you for that. And I want to take a couple more before we turn to next steps and public comment. And Camille, or do you have any comments? Sorry, was that Bill? Any final comments before we move to next steps? All right, not hearing any. Let's see, let me pull up the agenda. Agenda item number 9, next steps, Lindsay Cooper. But I want to thank everybody for sharing thoughts and all this feedback. I think is a very good discussion and moving the ball forward. Lindsay, are you going to provide next steps?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, as Harry mentioned, thank you everyone for some really great feedback and considerations. As GOCA jumps back into reworking the portfolio at the beginning of this timeline, it is our hope and ambition to have a revised portfolio to all of you by the week of November 29th, giving us about a month from now when we would send you a revised version and we would post this revised portfolio for public comment, hopefully bringing in, as we intend to bring in a lot of the issues and concerns and opportunities raised by the task force today, by all the feedback that we've gotten over the past month or two. Our goal then would be for the task force to reconvene either the week of December 6th or 13th to discuss the revised portfolio. We'll provide you all with either a track changes version or inline edits so that you can see exactly how changes have been made to the portfolio, but we'll also have a meeting to discuss revisions, likely focusing in on some of these big question areas and focusing in on the priorities timeline, but giving you all something to work with, a revised version that we can work through, talk through, bring some of these big issues back to the center attention. And then the week of December 13th, we will release a full draft plan. So the portfolio will be updated the week of the 29th in November, but then releasing the full plan. So all the context document alongside the portfolio for public comment and for feedback from all of you again. And again, that document, the context portion of the plan has been out 2 times now. So this will be its 3rd time out. But with that, we'll be adding in the emission profile and a few other things that have been left out of the last iteration of the partial final report alongside the portfolio. And then giving that about a month for you all to review, for the public to provide comment, and then reconvening after the holidays to discuss those comments, to put forward revisions into the final plan, and then likely adding in another meeting at the end of January so that we can approve and, as Flozell mentioned, talk through what the next steps are for this climate action plan. But wanted to give at least 2 more opportunities for robust discussion by the task force and a good buffer of time between when we send the revised portfolio and when we send the full draft before coming back together. But this is how we're approaching the rest of the year. I know it's changed a couple of times, but with Hurricane Ida, we had to restructure a lot towards the end of this year. So I know the timelines are tight. But with this, I would open it up to comments by any of the members or by the chair, and then turn it back over to you, Yuri.
Any comments or questions about the timeline, next steps? I want to make sure everybody is clear and of expectations and what's ahead. All right. Not hearing any. Thank you, Lindsay. And we will now move to public comment. Lindsay, would you mind checking the climate at la.gov? Interim, if any of our attendees have a public comment, please raise your hand and we'll call on you to make your comment. Matt Tar has his hand up.
Hello,
Matt.
are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to mention, I listened in part of the last meeting and most of this meeting, and I appreciate all the efforts and very open conversation that's gone on in these meetings, and the attentiveness to multiple approaches, including the efficiency items that were mentioned earlier. So thank you all for your efforts.
Other comments from the public, from our attendees? Lindsay, do you mind checking the climate email and letting know how many?
Yes. I do have one comment on the climate email. If I can read that out.
Go ahead and read it.
So the comment is from Kenitra Caston Hill of the Alliance for Affordable Energy, and her comment reads, thank you for your time and effort. How can we ever get to net zero while continuing to allow industries who pollute our air? I hear a great deal of talk regarding demand instead of focusing on industry demands. Let's focus on not polluting our communities. Let's demand change and move to clean jobs. Please define clean energy and renewable energy and not misuse these terms. The citizens of Louisiana have suffered so greatly over the years due to lack of oversight and monitoring of industry. So this is a great opportunity to change the narrative and save our land. Use this opportunity wisely so that children and grandchildren will be able to live in Southeast Louisiana. Thank you, Kenitra, for that comment. And I don't see any other comments.
All right. Well, thank you. And not seeing any public comment from our attendees, I want to just thank everybody for the good discussion today. As Lindsay went over, we will not be meeting for several weeks, so enjoy taking a little break from all of these task force meetings. I know there's a lot of work to do in the interim, and I hope you're all well in the interim. And so I will entertain a motion to adjourn unless there's any other questions from the task force.
So moved.
We have a motion by Mr. Calavoda, a second. Come on.
Second.
Second by Mr. Berg. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right. Thank you very much. Y'all have a wonderful day.